Welcome to the For Evansville podcast, a podcast about learning the needs and dreams of our city so that we can be not just in Evansville, but before Evansville, so we can make Evansville a place where everybody flourishes. We're really excited about our conversation today. My name's Jonathan Betcher, by the way, and I'm here with Ross Chapman, and we're actually recording this part of the podcast after a conversation that we already recorded, but our guest today was on a little bit of a tight schedule because we had him in from Portland, Oregon, and we had him doing all kinds of stuff
Very busy.
in Evansville during
busy.
the course of that day. But Ross, why don't you tell us a little bit about our guest and why we had him on the podcast?
Yeah, so our guest is Kevin Palau, and he is from Portland, and we brought him in for a specific purpose. We really wanted him to connect with people in our city who are thinking about how they integrate their faith into their city engagement in a very practical way, but in a holistic way. And so we really were excited to have him because he's been doing a lot of great work in his city for a long time. And he also represents an organization that does global work. His father was an evangelist, he would say like the Billy Graham of Latin America. And that was pretty cool to hear that. And actually, some of you may remember 20 years ago, Luis Palau came to Evansville. And we had the amazing privilege of bringing Kevin back to Evansville really for the first time since that event. And really, that's just a part of his story. Kevin has a lot different perspective on what his role is and how he connects in his city. And so you're going to hear his relationship he built with the mayor at the time of Portland and how they really formed an awesome partnership and a great friendship even in order to just be a blessing to their city, to help as many people flourish as possible in Portland. So we're really excited for you to hear that conversation. One of the things we do is bring leaders together to learn about how we can work together. What are some of the needs and dreams of the city? How can we help foster some trust among leaders? And so you guys get to listen in to him, and then Jonathan and I will talk about what we gleaned from that conversation when we come back. All right, so our guest and friend today on the podcast is Kevin Palau. Kevin is from Portland, Oregon, and he has some really cool things to share with us. On the podcast, we like to talk about the needs and dreams of our city. How can we move from just being in Evansville to being for Evansville, and really bringing people together to solve our city's most pressing needs. And one of the reasons we're excited to have Kevin on today is because he's been doing that in Portland for quite a long time, working alongside people who are not exactly the same, but all live in a city together and want to see it flourish, to grow, and to be a great place to live. And we had him out here speaking to some church leaders. And so, Kevin, we're just glad that you took some time to chat with us on the podcast.
It's really exciting to be back here after 21 years. I was here ages ago, and I love to be among leaders that are thinking that way, thinking what can we do, whatever our backgrounds, but particularly if people would call themselves in some way, shape, or form a Christ follower, what does it look like to be on mission, loving and serving our neighbors, partnering with people, like you say, that may feel very strongly different from us on certain things. There's still great ways we can find common ground.
Yes, for sure. Well, I think people will catch a lot of your story as we ask some questions, and you can kind of weave in who you are and why you were even here 20 years ago. But
Right.
I think I want to dive in just tell us a little bit about the relationship you made with the mayor at the time of Portland and kind of maybe you weren't on the same wavelength on a lot of things, but you guys ended up doing some really great work together that really had an impact on the city.
Yeah, Portland, if listeners don't know much about it, it's a very purposely quirky place. Keep Portland weird is like a famous motto, and it's between us and Austin, Texas.
Yeah, and there's a big sign, right?
Big signs and
Keep
stuff.
It weird.
And that's kind of, Portlanders are proud of being very progressive politically. It's a beautiful place as far as just the environment, but it's seen its share of violent protestings. People probably remember that from the news of the last few years, and it has been a place historically with some good examples in the midst of the pain. There's been some really good examples of people finding common ground around trying to make Portland a better place. So for me, the short story would be 100 or so Christian pastors and leaders recognizing that because of the national narratives and the way media covers us, I'll put myself in the category of a Christian leader, we've tended to sometimes be known what we're for what we're against and not what we're for. And so I think that was very much what we recognized, is that the average Portlander, if they thought at all about the church, it would tend to bring up negatives. You guys are anti this, anti that. We're trying to create a progressive utopia here.
Yeah.
You guys are standing in the way. Well, that was unfair to some degree, but that does no good to complain. You just have to go and positively build relationships. So the short version was, my dad and I went on behalf of a group of churches to sit down with our mayor, who at the time, this was a big deal in Portland because Portland fits our culture, was the first top 25 city in the country to elect an openly gay mayor. And for Portlanders, that was like a point of pride. But for some of us, it was like, there's historically lots of reasons why the Christian community, in particular, let's say the more evangelical Christian community, would have been viewed as at odds with the LGBTQ community. Obviously, we don't have to go into all that. So we weren't trying to solve every historical difference, but we did go in humbly saying, we know we're known for what we're against and not what we're for. We think that we could mobilize thousands of folks from our churches to love and serve Portland. You're our mayor. Would you help us do that effectively? We don't know what we're doing, to be honest. We don't know where the needs are as much as you would as the mayor. Would you help us discover ways to serve? And because we were humbly admitting that we're known for some not positive things, which that's how he viewed the Christian community too, from his experience, absolutely. And because we weren't asking for money or complaining, he was disarmed by that. And that wasn't what he was expecting from Christians. So I think the posture, we tried to just have it wasn't a conscious act. We just felt embarrassed that we hadn't had this conversation with the mayor before. And so I think he picked up the genuineness and the humility, and he had nothing to lose to try to help us find ways to serve. And when then we underpromised and overdelivered, and way more people volunteered over the long haul than were even suggested we might deliver, that really got his attention. And then even when he had a big personal crisis, and it was the evangelical Christian community that were quietly behind the scenes, personally encouraging him and standing with him, all those things really changed his mind and have created a long-lasting friendship. And I think have made Portland a little bit more of a safe place for people to be different in how they view the world, but still work for the common good.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and Jonathan, chime in with questions, but what sticks out to me is everyone was able to be themselves.
Yes.
And I think that gets lost sometimes when we say, hey, let's work together, or, I need to somehow lose a part of who I am in order to come to this table and work with other people that see things differently from me. And I don't think that's a good idea, and I don't think it works. I think people will not, in the long run, be committed to that. But if you can come and say everybody should bring their whole selves, everything they're passionate about, care about, that makes them who they really are, to the table, and still find common ground, man, I think that has a really cool impact, and I think that's exactly what you're talking about. So,
yeah, I'm really curious. First of all, I love the fact that you've used the term friendship. That this wasn't just a formal partnership. It wasn't like, hey, we're going to sit down with the mayor in this very transactional way and say, look, we can provide this if you provide this, but you actually sought to build a relationship. And you recognize that while you don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, significant things that a lot of people have gotten angry with each other about, you were able to see each other as people, and to honor and respect one another in that way, and to love one another in that way, and develop a friendship. I think that's huge. But that doesn't just magically erase all of the challenges that come with that. I think oftentimes the reason that we end up working together with people where we have philosophical alignment is ultimately because it's easier.
Yep.
It's easier
Yep.
to do that. There's not as much friction. There's not as much difficult conversations to have, or awkward or potentially hurtful conversations to have, and things to work through, questions to figure out. So I would love to hear, like, in your experience as you guys have kind of been on this journey together, what are some of the challenges that came up, and some of the ways that you guys had the opportunity to work through those things together?
Yeah, it's a good question. Between Sam and I, Sam Adams, like the beer, that's the name of the mayor.
Yeah.
And he's now former mayor, but
Sure.
he's back in Portland after going to Washington D.C., et cetera. I would say it's funny, we didn't really have conflict or challenges personally. It was more on behalf of our communities. I remember one time going to the first time that Sam and I got together after a year of working together, that it wasn't about our partnership and the churches working with the city and the Portland Public Schools, et cetera. And he asked me kind of casually, like, how much heat or how much tension are you facing from your community about this partnership? And I'm like, gosh, none. And he's like, had a shocked look on his face. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm getting a lot of pressure from my community that don't like the fact that I'm working with, these evangelical Christians. So that was kind of eye-opening for me, because it made me realize, like, I hadn't even really considered that. It's just like, oh, phew, people are giving the Palau Association. They know my dad, Luis Palau, and the churches know and trust us and recognize, like, okay, it's not compromising deeply held biblical values. It's just simply saying we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is a way to build trust. It's probably even a way for his dad, Luis Palau, who's an evangelist, to meaningfully, relationally, authentically communicate the message of Jesus. So we got a kind of a free pass in a way. He didn't, and I really admire him for that he didn't take the easy way out, which would have been to kind of turn on us and say, like, I'm calculating this whole thing out. It's not really worth it. But he just was strong enough as a leader to say, hey, you know what? I felt that way too, but let me tell you why my opinion changed because of the way I was treated personally, the fact that they haven't been aggressively proselytizing in the sense of inauthentically. People think in a place like Portland that every Christian is like a fire-breathing evangelist that is like street preaching and just behaving in like socially awkward ways. And when I've tried to help some of our LGBTQ community leaders to realize, like, our people struggle just as much as anyone else to articulate meaningfully what's important to them if they think they're going to be opposed. And I said, in a place like Portland, this is a very progressive place. Christians are in the distinct minority. Most Portlanders are very much on the proudly progressive agenda. Sure. So it's like having those conversations has helped some of our leaders realize, like, oh, hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah.
We're in the ascendancy. Like, we're the ones who have the cultural voice, and I hadn't really thought of it. I used to feel that way. Now, that's interesting that some of these other people that have become friends, they feel in the minority, and I wonder what that would be like. And so you can have those interesting conversations if you're willing to really listen, ask a lot of good questions.
That's really cool to hear about Mayor Adams and his courage.
Yeah.
I think it's important for a politician to have that. And I think it sounds like, I don't want to speak for him or something, but it sounds like he was very for Portland.
Yes.
And you were very for Portland. And
That's
that was some of your common ground. You might not use those words. Those are words we like to use. But that being kind of the chief priority over, what are the interests and reactions of my own community and how this might look or feel isn't as important as the good that we can do for our city together. And I think that's kind of a rare quality these days, and why we think it's so important to talk about. We're all really for Evansville around here. What does it mean to make that a priority, and what could we get done if we work together? Yep. So that's a really cool example, just from hearing that story.
I have one other quick, just corollary to it is this was another Sam idea, because he recognized, like, when we had that conversation, he recognized, like, wow, I'm kind of facing some heat from my community about this friendship. He suggested you gather the senior pastors of the largest churches in Portland, and I'll bring Portland's key LGBTQ plus leaders, and we'll just have a meeting in my office and just talk and get to know one another, because that's going to be good for Portland. And he was late to the meeting, and it was just like a middle school dance, like both, like, where the boys and girls are like, no one wants to talk to each other. So literally, like, the pastors were on one side of the boardroom, and the LGBTQ leaders on the other one. And finally, like, I walked over and tried to introduce myself, and the first guy that I was talking to literally put his hands behind his back and said, like, I'm here because Sam invited me. I don't really know the purpose of the meeting. But it was very clear, like, I don't trust you. I know who you guys are. He was very uncomfortable. And Sam began the meeting saying, like, hey, Kevin and I disagree on a lot of stuff, pretty important stuff. But we realize as we become friends that we agree on a lot more than we thought we would when it comes to believing in our school kids and wanting to be a help to the community. So we just feel like as a community, it's way better to focus on those issues without denying some of the previous hurt, et cetera. And so the whole meeting was just long introductions. And in our case, we one of our key pastors made a point of opening the door and saying, making it clear, like, we want to hear your stories of hurt that's been caused by our community, without any big defensiveness. And I think that went a long way, too, to demonstrating, like, okay, maybe we can, as a result of that, I got invited to speak at the Q Center, which is Portland's LGBTQ community center. And among other things, Barbara, the leader of that at the time, out of the blue, is like, one of my favorite songs is Amazing Grace. And, so tell us what does that mean? And give us some examples of, where you've experienced grace in your life. And so, like, some pretty softball questions that gave the opportunity to just talk about what does it mean to experience grace in general? What does it mean to experience God's grace? So that kind of approach, and again, I give Sam a lot of credit for consciously working to try to build bridges.
I think that the kind of relational groundwork that went into that is really something that we can learn a lot from. The trust building that you're talking about, and how it's a slow and awkward journey to build trust with somebody, especially when there is existing maybe reasons, valid reasons to have some distrust, And so I think we can learn a lot from that. I would also love to hear, what are some of the practical ways that the church has served the city of Portland since those relationships have been developed? What have you seen as, like, the things that have emerged as the value that the church has really been able to bring into the city since those relationships have been formed? And
the reason that the trust built to the degree that it did was because the church delivered way beyond Sam's expectation as mayor. So there was a personal relationship, but if it had just been a personal relationship and nothing would have come of it, I don't think it would have been at all the same. He was able to affirm it because, as he would say at times, even to critics, it's like when anybody else shows up with thousands of volunteers with no strings attached, come talk to me. So far, this is who shows up, period. So that kind of stopped people's critics. But really, I would say public school partnerships and the foster care system were the two, and after 15 years, remain very clear, compelling places. Both are places of incredibly high need, inarguable.
Right.
Everybody sees it. And so I think that high need means that almost anything done with the right attitude through the existing structures is valuable. So a small church that provides a couple of senior citizens reading once a week to third graders is hugely valued.
Right.
A few people, a small group coming and helping the teachers get the school ready, the outside school ready for the new school year, sounds like, that's just one small thing. Super valuable. So we have partnerships in Portland that involve like massive $1 million makeovers and Nike getting involved. And the vast majority of them seem like they're not that big a deal.
Yeah.
But a consistent feeling by a school principal that there's a church that they can count on, not for everything, but that feels like they have their back.
Yeah.
Same in the foster care system. So the same conversation we had with the mayor of, sitting down, we love you, thank you for serving, how can we serve? We're not experts. You tell us, and if we can help, we'll at least try.
Right.
That same conversation has opened up huge doors, and now the majority of schools in the Portland Public School, or actually the whole Portland metro area, have some level of a church-school partnership going. And the foster care system's been massively impacted by hundreds of church volunteers.
Yeah, I think that posture of humility just seems like such a big deal in those areas. I love that in each of those instances, it wasn't, hey, we're here to solve everything and fix all these
we
problems.
have a plan, and you guys aren't doing a very good job, but if we just helped you.
Recognizing the places where people in our city are already doing the hard work of serving and just need extra hands
and
on
recognizing that they're, treating them as servants, and therefore treating them, one, of course, everybody made in the image of God, but also like viewing their work as God-given work, maybe without saying it, although sometimes I would say things in certain ways, and you would see people thinking about it, and they at least understand that we view it that way, and they appreciate the seriousness of that we take that their work is a service to the community.
Yeah. I would think if you say to somebody, you seem very Christ-like, coming from somebody who Jesus is literally their favorite person, that would be hopefully come across as a compliment.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks so much for being with us today. It's been great.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Okay, so we just heard from Kevin and got the whole story of his journey with the mayor and how their partnership really grew into something great for Portland, and I think really demonstrated a lot of ways that the church in a particular city can be very helpful and beneficial to a city in the city's goals. And I think that's exciting. So Jonathan, I'm curious, what's really sticking out to you since hearing Kevin talk about his own journey in Portland?
The thing that I kind of take away the most is just the aspect of relationship and friendship that they built with the mayor. And it's such a beautiful picture, I think, of what we at For Evansville try to advocate for whenever we talk about working together. One of our core values is listen first, which is really why we do this podcast in general. But it's also a value that we think is valuable for anybody in our city who wants to be for Evansville, to listen first. And that doesn't just give you the opportunity to learn from somebody else or to learn about a particular need or an issue, but it gives you the opportunity to begin to build that relationship and to understand who somebody is as a person, and not see them as whatever kind of label you might first encounter whenever you meet them, or whatever kind of assumptions you might have based on what they believe or what you've heard about them or whatever. And so it's interesting in Kevin's story to see how there were probably some assumptions made on both sides, that they were going in and talking to the first openly gay mayor, and that he was going into that meeting talking to these conservative evangelical Christians. There's a certain perception whenever you walk into that room on both sides. But over time, trust was developed, and they were able to build a relationship without either of them really changing their perspective or worldview or opinions, but still being able to have relationship, honor and respect one another, and really love one another, work together. So I think that's kind of the coolest takeaway from their story for me.
I think that's a big one. And as you're talking, it made me think about how we really need examples of what it means to live well with one another in a pluralistic society. In a pluralistic society, that's where there's a whole bunch of different beliefs and religious viewpoints or philosophical viewpoints. We're not all going to agree. That's kind of the great American experiment.
Yeah.
We're all here together. And I think as a person of faith, it's important to me to have somebody who can inspire me and show me a path forward, to say hey, I don't have to sacrifice really what I believe in order to accept other people or even participate with them in common goals.
Right.
And it's just so cool it's kind of a high profile relationship that Kevin built. And it can be done like on that level. And so of course I can do it then with my neighbors.
Right.
I can do it with people in my city who, we may not agree on everything, but I don't have to leave my faith at the door in order to work together. And I don't expect anybody else to.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. So that's really inspiring. I think Kevin is a really inspiring person for that. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I noticed about him, and it's probably doesn't come through as much on the podcast, he's a really good listener. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about us listening first is kind of our core value. Everything we do is about like, let's listen first. And some would say the way that you show love is to listen. Mm-hmm. But if you're actively listening, that means you're not formulating your opinion while the other person is talking.
Yeah.
And while that is
like
maybe goes without saying, right?
Yeah.
But like we do that all the time, just as individuals, we're constantly formulating like our response rather than even reading the post thoroughly or listening to the person talking on the other end. And it's just really important that we give people dignity by listening to them. And I think that's what sticks out to me in the conversation with Kevin is each side made real sacrifices and effort to really honor the dignity of the person they were trying to build a relationship with and really accomplish something great together.
Yeah.
And because they worked hard at that and kept with it, and it did cost them some things, they were able to create something really beautiful.
Yeah. Part of the work that we do is definitely bringing Christian church leaders together for the good of the city. Mm-hmm. And so I think this conversation about how does somebody from that specific faith perspective, or really any worldview, but specifically for Christians and church leaders, to be able to have a framework for how can I live in a city where not everybody agrees with me, not everybody sees things the same way, and how can I still like work together and work towards some common goals and common good in the community is really valuable and important.
When we talk about the common good and the flourishing of every person, we might all have in our city, there might be several different definitions of what that might look like, but there is a lot in common.
Sure.
And so if you're convinced of that and you want to love your neighbor well, then, C.S. Lewis says love is the pursuit of another's highest good. Mm-hmm. And so my highest good for anyone then is that they would have the opportunity to live life to the full and what Jesus meant by that. And I think that's experiencing flourishing relationally, educationally, vocationally, economically, spiritually, physically. It's holistic. And so any place where that's not happening is an opportunity for Christians to engage in that, but also so many other people in our city want to engage in that.
Right.
And sometimes we just need some language and some relational trust in order to get the ball rolling. And I think that's where we've spent a lot of our time over the last 6 years is really trying to understand the city well and then helping people make those connections. And so bringing somebody in like Kevin is a great opportunity for us to go, hey, this is what happened in Portland. And it was really cool to see churches and city government and nonprofits and businesses kind of coming together around the idea of let's just be about the good of Portland.
Right.
So I think in Evansville, let's take advantage of the opportunity we have to just work together. There's so many good things happening. And sometimes it just takes that little bit of listening and building the trust and saying, hey, you care about that thing and I care about that thing. We might not like exactly agree on everything, or you might be an East Sider and I might be a West Sider, or, we didn't go to the same high schools, or, we're from different denominations or even different faiths.
Right.
But we care about foster care, we care about housing, or we care about mental wellness. And so let's find the ways that we can work together.
Yeah.
That's a different mental model or a different philosophy of saying, how can we tackle our city's problems together, than saying hey, if you don't believe like I believe, if you don't think like I think, if you don't vote like I vote, then I can't work with you.
Yeah.
That mindset is really going to lead us down a path I don't think any of us wants.
Right.
So let's recognize that we're actually on the same team.
Right. And it's an opportunity to learn and grow together for sure. Well, how has your relationship to the city or your perspective of your city been influenced by your faith perspective or your worldview or your philosophy of the world and life. We'd love to hear about it, whether you come from a Christian faith tradition or another faith, or maybe religion isn't really part of your life. We'd love to hear kind of how you think about this conversation, and maybe relationships that you've built with people who have a very different perspective, and what have you learned from those relationships, or what opportunities have you had to work together. We'd love to hear stories, experiences that you've had, maybe questions. So get in touch with us at connect@forevansville.org, or find us on Instagram and Facebook at 4Evansville.